And so now we're back to the point where you have gotten that review back. And so we're going to consider sort of two different scenarios. One is the good score, where it's going to move on immediately to counsel and you think you have a good shot at getting funded. And the other is a poor score or not discussed, and this is where you're going to immediately move into resubmission mode. So now going on to the fuller resubmission, here's a quote from the Ogden and Goldberg book, which I think Elena had mentioned the other day. And as you can see, no matter how difficult it may be to shrug off an unfavorable summary statement, shrug it off you must and proceed to a well-written, positive, improved revision. And then there's a couple other points here. There's nothing to gain and everything to lose by contesting a comment, so you don't want to call the reviewer stupid and so on in your official response. You can do whatever you like in your own head. And then the goal of submitting proposal is to get the funds to support your research. So it's not the time to have major theoretical debates or discuss controversies and so forth. To some extent, you need to just capitulate and do what you can to make your resubmission competitive. So the way you want to approach this is to deconstruct the summary statement. Go through that summary statement and pull out the comments, enumerating them point by point, starting to put them into thematic groups because some of the reviewers will have similar kinds of comments. And you don't want to just look at the weaknesses. You do want to look at the strengths too. So you want to make sure that you are seeing what really resonated with the reviewers and make sure that you continue to highlight those aspects of the work and, don't cut the aim they loved. Make sure you keep that one. But maybe you want to cut the aim that they all hated. So, be thinking about that. And it's also really good to get another opinion on this to make sure that you're really reading the reviews in the right way and that you're understanding what the comments are. There is a little bit of an art form to deciphering what a reviewer is trying to tell you. They don't always tell it to you in a real straightforward way. So it can be very helpful to have someone else who's had a lot of experience reading summary statements go through your summary statement and see if what you're pulling out of it is what they're pulling out of it as well. Anything to add, Bill?
No, just to emphasize something that we've talked about many times in the past. You're a salesman. You're trying to sell something, and you're not going to sell something by telling the customer he's an idiot. Okay?
Yeah. You should want this.
You want this, and you have to convince them of that. You have to be their best buddy.
And it's also good to talk to your program officer. They were likely in the room when your application was discussed. They might have notes that they can share with you. Sometimes there's something that happened at the table that's really brought everybody's scores down. Your program officer will know that. And again, it might not be so clear in the critiques where or when that happened, but your program officer can help kind of give you some insights as to why maybe something went the way it did or why maybe the score doesn't seem to match the critiques or something along those lines. Okay, so once you have that, you need to come up with your plan of attack. You've got two tasks. One is to do this introduction to the resubmission that sort of encapsulates your response, and the other is to actually change the proposal where appropriate. So we're going to focus now in the rest of this talk pretty much on the response to reviewers and assume that you can use the other principles we've talked about in grant writing to actually write the resubmission and change that. But you're going to go through all of the same sorts of things that you do when you write the first version of the grant to write your resubmission. You still want to share it with others, get feedback, all of those kinds of things. So typically your response to critique is going to start with an introduction. Now this response to critique is typically one page. There's some mechanisms where you might get a little more than that, but usually it's one page for RO3s and RO1s. So you've got very limited space to respond to the critiques. But usually people will start with some kind of introduction. So here's one example. We thank the reviewers for their careful reading of our initial submission. You always thank the reviewers even though you don't like them and aren't gratuitous. Most people will say, and sometimes there's some controversy here about doing this, but the reviewers noted a number of strengths. Sometimes people in this group will say, well, you're wasting space noting the strengths, but others of us like to note the strengths so that you're starting out on a positive note and sort of saying, other people liked these things, you should probably like them too. And so here there's an enumeration of the things that the reviewers liked, and you can just read that on your own. And then we have retained these strengths and carefully addressed the weaknesses noted by the reviewers. And so then they're going to go into now a more enumerated list of what those things are. They're also noting here that the major changes are summarized below. So you don't have to summarize every single change you made because, again, you only have one page. So what you want to do here is try to pick out the major things that you think really drove the scores away from the pay line. And that's what you want to be addressing here, are those major issues. You want to address minor issues too, but that's just going to be in the revision of your grant in the longer text. You don't need to highlight those.
Yeah, back to the do I list the strengths and then take up space. That has a large answer in who is going to review that revision. Okay, it may not be. There's some probability that no one who read your first grant will read your revision. NIH will try desperately to avoid that, but it may be unavoidable. So yes, the person who read your first grant probably, but maybe not, will remember who you are, remember the grant, and the strengths may not be necessary, but you can't trust that that's going to happen. So I definitely believe that you, as succinctly but as strongly as you possibly can, say what the previous people liked. Because otherwise that message may never get to the people who are going to look at your revision.
And again, if you're writing that letter to council, this would be, again, after you've done that kind of general advocacy paragraph, this would be the next paragraph in that letter that, again, might be highlighting what the reviewers liked, and then you're going to give a response to some of the weaknesses. So here's another one, same kind of thing. Overall, the reviewers were quite excited about this proposal. So going into that, the PI thanks the reviewers for their helpful comments. And then the revised proposal contains, and now this is one where they have done some significant preliminary studies. So you see they've added 8 preliminary studies. So if you have collected additional pilot data and so on, that's good to highlight in this introduction. And then they also enumerate some of the significant revisions to the different sections as well.
Yeah, as Lisa Cunningham said yesterday, when you have that drink after you got your proposal off, go back to work.
Do those 8 preliminary studies. Okay, and here's another example. Uniform enthusiasm was expressed about, and now they kind of go by the review criteria here, the investigative team, the innovation, and the environment. At the same time, questions were raised about the approach, and the reviewers were split on the significance. So here's an example of the same kind of thing, but now aligning it a little more by sections and by those sub-scores or criterion scores. You'll also note that on most of these introductions to examples, they've also noted in some way of how changes are denoted in the text. So one common thing is to put a vertical line in the margin where you have significant revision. You don't usually line, every single minor thing, like where you had to cut words just to get into the page limit because you made some other major change. But if there are, certain large paragraphs of text where you've made changes, you might use this vertical margin. Others will do some other font changes, which I don't like, where they italicize all of the changes or underline all of the changes in the font. I personally find that distracting, but you do see that as well. Okay, so then after you've had that general introduction, now you're going to go into specific, again, major concerns that the reviewers raised and how you went about addressing those. So we've tried to kind of group them into some different sorts of themes. So here's one that has to do with the investigative team, where someone had recommended a statistical consultant. So this is straight, the first line here is straight from what was written in the review. And then the response is what's below that, and it's basically that a statistician was added, and then a little bit more detail, not just, we stuck a statistician on here because you wanted one, but now what are they doing? How have they added to the analysis approach? Oh, and you also note, too, that it points you to where in the text you're going to see that elaboration. So it's pointing you the B, C 2.4 or whatever, that's a particular header in the grant that the reviewer could then go to see the details of how the analysis approach was clarified or changed.
Yeah, and C2 means critique, point to the second critiquer.
Okay, now here's a critique about aims. So the original critique was it wasn't clear how the experiments proposed for aim 3 relate to the theme of aim 3. So basically the reviewer didn't like aim 3. And so then the response was to agree and then to go ahead and delete that aim. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a particularly good way to respond. You just don't want to say I was an idiot the first time. You're right. Okay. I think you need to find a way to say that, you know, I still don't think we made a big mistake, but I understand where you're coming from, and I think to make things better, we're going to move on and do something different. So I do think you don't, as one of our rules we'll see in a minute, you know, you just don't say yes, 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 yes to the reviewer. You show that you really thought this through and you have reasons for doing what you're doing.
Okay, here's one on significance. So the reviewer says it's not clear that some of the literature that was cited can be applied to children. And so now here's the response, that there's studies of general learning in children that support the applicability of the concepts to this group. And then there's also some feasibility data that further demonstrate the applicability of these concepts to this particular group. So trying to make that link more explicit for the reviewer.
And throughout all this, the earlier discussion we have about not being vague now really comes into play.
This is another feasibility preliminary study kind of critique. It would be helpful if there were pilot data for such and such. And so now the revised proposal provides new pilot data, and it shows the technique is a feasible approach. Okay? So again, you always want to not just say, "Oh, we added pilot data," but go forward and be specific about what that shows or how that really meets the reviewer's concern. Here's some issues with approach. There's no discussion of statistical power. So we had that come up in a couple of reviews yesterday. And so here's a response to that. And so first of all, now this is a good example of where, maybe the reviewer didn't exactly know what they were doing, and rather than the grant writer saying, well, you're an idiot, they come back and they're kind of tutorial in helping the reviewer understand the difficulty of what they're asking the applicant to do. So they say that procedures for estimating power in this particular area are not established, and they go on to sort of show, it's not the same as just computing a power on a t-test. This is a more sophisticated analysis technique. And so then they do say, though, how they have tried to figure out power, but then they move on to say, but more convincing is our ability to detect multiple converging effects using the proposed experimental procedure. So they sort of give this tutorial to the critiquer and then do try to do something to meet the concern and meet it in several different kinds of ways. Okay, here's another issue with the approach, the generalizability to different levels of socioeconomic status is not considered. Okay, so they had some concerns here. And so then the response, and again, this is sort of the same kind of thing where maybe you don't really know the literature here, but instead of saying that you don't know the literature, I'm going to just tell you what you need to know. So even though we typically find no differences in SES between preschool age X and Y, we plan our analytical models to take SES into consideration. So, here it's no problem to add in the SES information and see if it contributes anything. We don't really expect it does, and you're kind of silly for thinking that maybe, but we just won't say that. We'll let it go. Another approach issue, concerns or confusion about the dependent variable, and this could either be what it is or how it's measured or why there's several different ones, what each one contributes. And so here's the response. This was a case where they weren't sure maybe what dependent variable went with what sort of hypothesis or why you need to. So this is clarified. Use of accuracy versus reaction time depends on basically whether you're getting ceiling level performance or not. And again, the feasibility data demonstrates our ability to detect differences. So if they're worried about how this dependent variable is going to operate in your particular population, having those feasibility data will help to deal with that concern very effectively. Okay, so that's it for some of the examples. Of course, there's many more, but you get kind of the flavor of it, that you're not going into long detail in this introduction to resubmission. You just don't have time. You want to succinctly summarize some of the major issues and then succinctly summarize your approach or the way you handled those major issues, and then you'll do a more detailed revision, obviously, in the body of the grant. So here's some things, though, to keep in mind as you're writing this response to review. You need to watch your language. There's nothing to gain and everything to lose by confrontation. So again, calling the reviewer stupid or suggesting that they're ignorant of important scientific concepts and these types of things isn't going to get you anywhere. So you need to take the blame for the mistakes. So, for example, here's one here on the slide. The PI didn't state the material clearly in an accessible to review manner, whatever, or even not say that at all. Just, provide the information needed. Give the tutorial information so that the reviewer understands why you're doing things in a particular way in your area. So adversarial language is self-defeating. Just let it go. Okay, so the revision should be substantive. So really don't, even if your score was pretty close to the pay line, don't just think, I'm going to change a couple things and that'll be good. Really look at those summary statements and really take to heart the reviewer's concerns and make a good effort to revise everything. So some sources of the material for the revision. We've seen now the summary statement, how you're going to take those summary statement comments into account, but you need to think beyond the summary statement. So one might be your own preliminary data. Maybe you've run some studies in the meantime and you've realized, something's not going to work. Well, even though the reviewer didn't question whether something was going to work, if you know it's not going to work, you need to change it. So, take into account whatever has gone on in your lab since that initial revision and make sure that you incorporate whatever new knowledge you've come up with into that revision. Likewise, there might be recent findings from others, and so you're going to need to incorporate whatever articles have come out since you've submitted this application the first time. If you've added on colleagues or collaborators, or if they have pursued their work in terms of other grant applications or other publications, whatever they've found out from doing that needs to be incorporated as well. You might need to rethink your methods. You might need to refine or clarify various aspects of your aims, significance, innovation, or approach. And again, try to highlight your revisions, the major revisions, in the margin in some way. And now here we kind of say what not to include. So yes, you want to be comprehensive in your revision, but you want to be careful. So include new revised materials to satisfy the reviewer concerns. That's good. But don't include things that really aren't relevant to the reviewer's concerns. So, don't go off on some sort of tangent or, open up new criticisms. You might need to delete some things, but really think about the things that you're adding. Anything new is open up to new critique. Did you want to add?
Be somewhat careful about adding your preliminary data or pilot data, feasibility material. Be sure it really is supportive of what you're proposing. Quite often, you rush off, you do some pilot work in order to deal with the criticism, and it's not real clear what's going on. Look hard at that before you put it in, because you may only be amplifying the reviewer's concern.
Don't simply do what the reviewer suggests. So we have said, kind of capitulate to the reviewer, but, be careful with that. And I think Lisa Cunningham gave a great example the other day of how she responded to the reviewer's concern. They wanted her to do a particular technique, but it was going to require a gajillion mice to do that. So if she hadn't really thought it through and had just said, oh, yeah, fine, we'll do technique X, stick it in, but hadn't really thought it through and thought about the implications of that, she would have actually made a problem for herself. Because if she had done that and then gone through the next stage of review, someone familiar with that technique would have likely said, you're going to need a gajillion mice for that. That's just not feasible. So do think through what the reviewers are telling you to do. Their suggestion that they came up with when they were tired and cranky and had thought about it for only 30 seconds may not be an actually good suggestion. So And then don't dismiss the reviewer's concern because their solution was not very good or wasn't optimal. You need to think about, well, why are they suggesting that? What is really the underlying concern? And think about the best way, the optimal way to address that concern. So don't just do what they tell you, but really think through if that's a good solution to whatever the concern is. All right, get to work. A revision's only going to receive an improved score if it has been significantly rewritten. You must spend a non-trivial amount of time writing and rewriting grants. It's not any faster when you're revising it than the first time you wrote it. You still have all of those same kinds of steps. Don't shortchange it. You still need to do that internal review before the resubmission. You can't just, wait forever and then the week before the deadline suddenly, bang out the revision. That's not going to work. So you really need to set aside enough time to get the job done and get it done right. You don't have a lot of time to wallow in self-pity and leave those summary statements in the drawer forever. You can leave them in the drawer for a couple days, but then you need to pull them out and really get to work and make your plan B. Okay, so now what happens, this is maybe a little out of date. We had in here what happens if your second application is not funded. And now we do know that you can put that back in as a new submission. But I still think you really want to think about whether that's in your best interest. And this is going to be another case where it's good to talk to your program officer about that, to talk to your mentors, and really think through if it's going to be in your best interest to go in with a new submission. And even if you decide not to go in with a new submission to NIH, you still need to look at these summary statements and think about what it is that's resonating with people in the field, what is not resonating with people in the field, and how you might change your approach to these things.
I would say in the next year, given this new redefinition of resubmission after an A1, it's not that you should talk to your program officer. You have to talk to your program officer. This is new. It's going to be interpreted. They're going to be the front line of the interpretation. You're going to have to talk to them to figure out what to do next.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you're going to go back to some of the same reviewers.
Yeah, no matter. Even if you go to a different agency, you might go back to the same reviewer. So it's never good to ignore your reviewers. They're going to pop up somewhere else. They're going to pop up in your manuscript review. So, be thinking about what they're telling you. And really, if one person in the field has this opinion, they're probably not alone. So even if you don't get that exact same reviewer, you're probably going to get someone who has sort of similar theoretical background and emphases and so on. So you really can never ignore your summary statement. It is telling you something, and you've just got to figure out what that message is and how you can move forward with that particular message.
And if you get funded, read your summary statement, study it, okay? Unless it's your last grant, then that might
Even
be
if
it.
It is.
But no, you're going to do this again and again and again and again, and this is a huge educational experience. Use it.
And also, even when you're funded, those reviewers might still have some good ideas that are going to help you out as you move this work forward. Is that what you were going to say or something else? No.
Sometimes you don't realize how smart they were until you're 2 years into your study, and then you realize that, and this is the truth. They're smart people. That part where the reviewer can respond to you and it doesn't go into the reviews? Remember we saw that yesterday? Comments directly from the reviewer to you. If they do that for you, I think often they're really saying, if you did this thing, I would really look favorably on here, or you should really go read this article, or you should try this technique. I'd pay special attention to that. It's kind of like a gift to you, that reviewer. So.
Okay, and there's some options on the slide here for what you might consider. If your revision isn't funded, you might consider reconceptualizing the grant and going to a different agency. You might do some preliminary work with internal funding or free labor like student projects. Maybe you really just needed some more preliminary data and some more publications to sort of set the foundation for what you're doing. And maybe it'll turn out that you have to abandon this particular project or this particular approach to your grand challenge question, but it doesn't mean that you abandon your grand challenge question or you abandon your mission statement. You're just abandoning this little piece of it. So keep that in perspective. Okay, so lots of people encounter the worst case scenario. You're not alone, and I mean, this is true at any time. We've already kind of talked about it. There's many of us in the room, probably all of us really, have experienced some form of rejection with grant writing, if not a lot of rejection in grant writing. So, you're not alone. This should not be something where you think, should I leave my career? Is this really what I meant to do? This person doesn't like my project, so should I just throw the whole thing out the door? The answer is most likely no. But really don't let it derail you in that way. We all come up with these roadblocks, but if you really are happy with the things you're doing, if you're really invested in the kinds of questions that you're asking, this is really just a small roadblock on your path to that. So don't abandon the path just for that. Okay, and here's some parting words for Ed Conture, which we should have mentioned him at the beginning. He was one of the people who had worked on this talk previously, and a lot of his notes and advice are part of this. But he says, above all, listen to the summary statement. It may not be singing your song, but it is telling you a story, and you should be listening. There will be a test, namely your next submission and review.
Let me just take a second and talk about non-discussed proposals. Okay. First of all, that word is appropriate. That means that your proposal was not discussed by the study section. It doesn't mean it was not reviewed. The primary, secondary, tertiary reviewers all reviewed it. They submitted the reviews. They're up there. What you will not see in your summary statement, if you were not discussed, is you will not see a panel summary or a study section summary, because they didn't discuss it. Okay, what you will see is the individual critiques, strengths and weaknesses of each one of the criteria of the review process. Now, those critiques have no benefit from discussion. So if one of the reviewers was off base and would have come back on base because of a discussion, that's not going to happen. So the variability may be greater in terms of the accuracy of what you're reading, okay? So it becomes much more difficult, and your program officer isn't going to be able to help to the same extent. There was no discussion. He or she can't tell you, well, really and truly what the real path here you need to follow, because it didn't happen. They don't know that. Not that you shouldn't talk to them and get more insights, but their ability to help you is now going to be significantly limited. So it's tough to read the summary statement, to read these three critiques, look at the strengths and weaknesses, and figure out what the hell am I supposed to do, okay? First of all, should I just give up? I didn't get discussed. No, do not give up. I gave the example the other day, and I'm not kidding. Someone did not get discussed. Very difficult. I helped this person. Very difficult to figure out why. You could see the numbers, but the wording didn't seem to match the numbers. Okay? And yet this person got the second highest rated proposal the very next time she went in. Okay? What happened in this case? Well, the message was something's wrong. Somehow, at least one reviewer, you could tell by the score, and maybe somewhat of another by the scores, just didn't like what you did. Okay? So it was out of my area, so, we both knew the obvious. Get people in your area to read it, okay, and redo it. And she did a pretty significant rewrite without really changing the basic experiments or data analysis or anything, because that wasn't clear. That's what she had to do. Okay, she just reconceptualized it. She used more positive valence, as Shelley was talking about. She does lots of things, and boom. Okay, so don't read that summary statement and say, I don't know what to do. Okay, you have to change it. Okay, you have to go back and figure out how to get your message across in a better way, and you've given it your best shot. So your best opportunity to get new insights on how to do that is other people, a mentor, a colleague, whatever, colleagues.
You don't have the benefit of a panel discussion, a summary of the discussion. So what do you respond to? So what if your critiques are vastly different?
Well, you can do You can do a similar sort of thing. You hopefully could find that there were some consistencies among the strengths listed among the 3 reviewers and say, it appears as if the 3 reviewers liked blah, blah, blah. It appears as if there was an issue about my productivity. That seemed to come up, and here's what I've done about that. That's always a really tough one. You know, you're not going to go out and publish 10 articles in the time between the first submission and the second submission, okay? So if your productivity is low, you've got an uphill battle. So the first message is don't let your productivity go low, okay? That's the obvious input, but maybe that's just where you're at. So you have to respond. If you've presented papers, anything that you can do with your productivity, you can do.
So the other thing, though, that I would add to that, you do get your criterion scores, so that should help you. So if you see you got 1 on significance and 7 on approach, that's telling you what drove your score down, that the approach was really the thing that sunk your application for that particular reviewer. So that's going to tell you that that's a major area. So you can use your criterion scores, even if you're not discussed, to sort of help figure out what did they like. Did they like the investigative team? Did they like the significance, but they didn't like the approach? And the other thing is reviewers should be giving you somewhat clear feedback on what they felt were major weaknesses versus minor weaknesses. So you'll still get the critique that shows the strengths that the reviewer saw and the weaknesses that they saw, and you want to try and reconcile those strengths and weaknesses with whatever their criterion score was. So it should be in the way that they've written it, should give you a little bit of a clue of whether they felt that a particular weakness was minor or more major. And so you need to try to kind of read between the lines on that to figure out what was the thing that really drove that 7 on approach. It's probably not every single weakness that's listed. It's probably 3 or 4 of them, and you need to try to figure out which ones.
Okay, I just want to point out that people who don't get discussed, you shouldn't feel like you're missing out on this great big font of information. Right. It's a paragraph, 4 to 5 sentences, that is going to touch on the highlights and lowlights. It's not even going to cover everything that's in those individual reviews. So don't feel like you have nothing to go on because you're missing those 4 to 5 sentences. You're not.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, go right ahead.
A few situations for you to respond to talk about. So, common situations to discuss as well would be when there are factual errors in the review. I mean, flat-out factual, disprovable errors. The case where the scores, where the reviewer scores don't match the impact score at all, which people, I think, often encounter. And then the case where the reviews are so terse that you really don't get a lot to respond to, and so you have these impact scores. So, where you have, PI, good, or strengths, good, weaknesses, no concerns. PI, 7, right? So, that happens, right? And then if there are cases, I think there are cases when the PI should give up on the particular idea. So I think it's worth identifying what those are. And sometimes those come from those very terse. So anyway, so those 3 things. Okay. Well, the one.
What was the first one? Factual errors? That there were 4 versus 3 points, maybe?
Oh, that was harsh.
That's how you respond. So anyone actually from the audience want to take any of those situations?
Yeah, let me take a couple of them.
Yeah, have personal experience with some of those?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot that have experience.
The second, I worked with Ed on doing this the first time, and I was new here and didn't know anything. The second time I went back and looked at my career, 85% of the submissions I've made in grants got turned down at least once. 8 out of 10 grants that I have submitted got turned down. And I've never not been funded. I've never not been funded by more than one agency. Okay? I don't give up. Okay? I'm just going to not let them beat me down. Now, every once in a while, I have a grant at the NSF that was a bomb. Okay? I actually got it. It didn't work. I abandoned it quickly, So it's not like I'm stupid stubborn. Okay, I hope I'm smart stubborn. So here's an incident. A reviewer says, I'll make it trivial, but the point is well made. Nowhere in the proposal could I find what the level of the stimuli were going to be. That's really important. And you say, my God, it's right in the general methods section. I can see it. It's right there. You idiot, it's on line 15. No. I'm sorry that I did not make it clear in the proposal as to the level. We did mention it in the general section. We have now tried to reiterate it at the key points in the proposal. It was 75 dB SPL. You idiot. Okay? So, yeah, you find the common ground there. Okay? The literature does not support your contention. What? Since Helmholtz, people have been pointing this out. Okay? Perhaps our literature review was not thorough enough given the page limitations. That's a great cop-out. Okay? We now have included and want you to recognize the following literature. Unfortunately, it's longer than the 2 pages that I could... No. But, sometimes, But there are substantial articles. I suggest, for instance, you read the reviews by... blah, 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 or the chapter or the books by blah, 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 whatever. I'm exaggerating. But you need to find this mid-ground between you're the bad guy, you're the one that made a mistake, it wasn't clear, whether you believe that or not, that's, I think, the approach you should take, and then provide the information and point out that actually you did, in fact, know what you were talking about or did present the information.
And I think another thing you can do, too, is you might want to talk to your program officer about some of these issues as well. So, again, it might depend on exactly what your score was. I mean, if it was not discussed, any of these sort of, inaccuracies or kind of bad reviewer behavior, might not help you in any way. But it could help you if you were, again, more on the bubble or something, if you were able to have a conversation with your program officer about, maybe this terse review where it looks like the person barely read the grant and yet gave it a score. That might do something for you because they would have some power to pull it up for counsel to look at it.
Yeah, let me talk a couple other scenarios.
Before we move on, I would just want to add to that in your one-page response, if a reviewer wants substantially more information about a particular area and you've got a 6-page grant, and as Mario said, you used that whole 6 pages the first time, I often put in what I took out of the grant in order to put the more stuff in. And that way the new set of reviewers doesn't say conversely, oh, you now didn't pay enough attention to this. And so I'll say, in order to provide this additional information, I've reduced the section on blah, blah, blah.
Wow, that is so important. I can't tell you the number of times in which I have had people tell me that they took out experiment 1 in order to meet the reviewers, only to find on the revision that the next reviewer said, you can't do this without experiment 1. I mean, basically. So letting them know why it wasn't there is a great idea. So a classic example of not enough information in a non-discussed proposal that I see all the time. In fact, I used a term once that I sometimes think the strengths and weaknesses are pull-down menus. Is not enough detail, period. How many times have you experienced people see that? The approach in experiment 3C did not provide enough detail. What detail? Okay. Now that could have come up in the discussion and might have been highlighted, and a reviewer might have gone back and changed and added more information. But if you don't have a discussion, you're not going to get that. Okay. All I can tell you in that case is there's something in that experiment that a really knowledgeable person didn't find. Okay. So you got to pore over that and try to figure out what that was. Okay. It's really tough. There might be something in the overall context of where they're coming from and the strengths and weaknesses that point you into what that detail might have been. But it is tough. You do have a challenge.
Other responses from folks about some of the questions that Chris threw out? How about when to abandon a project? So that was one of those that I don't think we've talked about at all. How do you know when you should just stop with that particular version of a project? Anybody have experiences?
Well, I mean, there's some big clues.
Admit it.
If you're getting 2 out of the 3 people in weaknesses, just saying that I really do not think this experiment can advance the field. I really do not think it does what the investigator says it's going to do. And you don't find a really clear argument against that. Well, these are smart people, as Shelley said. These are experienced people. These are people who've reviewed lots of grants and everything. They're probably not unique, okay? That's a clue at that point. Just because lack of enthusiasm drives a huge amount of this. We've been talking on and on and on again about trying to get the reviewers enthusiastic, and if you don't, that might be a sign to move on. A positive way to move on is when you know, okay, this particular approach doesn't seem to be flying, but I have another way. I have another way to get at this. I didn't think it was the best way, but I'm now going to go out and throw it out there with my colleagues, my mentor, whomever, and see. So you're staying with a theme. You're going forward. You're doing that. Would have been particularly good in the old days when you couldn't resubmit an A1, but I still think it's applicable now.
I wanted to respond to Chris's comment about these terse reviews, and especially about investigator. So if you have a comment like good, and then the investigator is rated a 7 or a 6 or something like that, how to interpret that, I think, is that that's a good investigator. And remember, we heard that NIH is not interested in funding good research. They're interested in funding excellent research. So in my experience, if you see a comment like good, that probably means just that. It's good. It's not excellent. And that could reflect things like a record of publication. It could reflect things like the quality of the institutional support. So I think it gets to things like publication record, quality, intellectual environment that you're operating in. I think that at that point, that's a good discussion to have with your program officer, and to think about, if I want to move this idea forward and I want to move my research program forward, how can I move that statement of good to a statement of excellent type of thing? So that's how I would interpret that kind of comment. Final comments from Holly or Bill? This was really, really helpful. Thank you so much for your expertise.